welcome back, guys. In today's lecture we're going to start our class in routing protocols, and basically in this class we're going to understand the theory behind static, default and dynamic routing. Before we can go to the configuration part, we should understand what is meant by each routing protocol, right? So in this case we're going to study about static routing, default routing and dynamic routing, right? So before we may begin our class, guys, kindly subscribe to our channel, right? Okay guys, we are good to go. So routing is a process which is performed by a layer 3 device. A layer 3 device basically can be a router or layer 3 switches, right? It's performed by layer 3 devices in order to deliver packets by choosing the best path or an optimal path from one network to another. Optimal path basically is the same as the best path, right, to route the packets. So basically routing is a process that is carried out by layer 3 devices, which are routers or layer 3 switches, in order to deliver packets from one network to another by choosing the best path, right? Okay, so by default a router knows only the direct connected network. Underline this one, guys. By default a router knows only the direct connected networks. For example, in our case here in the diagram below, the router 3 here only knows this network and this one, okay? Only this one and this one, the direct connected networks by default, right? So basically this network can communicate with this network even without us configuring routing protocols, because the router by default knows those direct connected networks. The same way this router here, router 1, knows about 3 networks: this one and this one, okay? This one, the direct connected networks. And finally router 2 knows only 2 networks: this one and this one, the direct connected networks. So you must understand this part. A router by default knows only the direct connected network. So it's upon the configuration of the routing protocols that will make this router aware that there are some other networks in the topology. It's basically depend on the routing protocol that you will configure that will make this router 3 here knows that there's this network, and there's this network, right? So that's the criteria that we're going to learn under these 3 routing protocols, okay? The category of routing protocols, there are 3. So the types of routing protocols, basically we have 3 categories. We have static, we have default and dynamic, okay? And don't worry about anything, we're going to understand how to configure each routing protocol, and in the next class we will start with static, then we go to default, and now dynamic is very wide. This is where we will dwell much of our time, right? So under dynamic routing protocols we have interior gateway protocols and exterior gateway protocols, okay? Then under interior gateway protocols we have distance vector, link state and hybrid, okay? Under distance vector protocols we have RIP. RIP basically stands for routing information protocol, okay? It's a distance vector protocol under dynamic routing, okay? Then we have interior gateway routing protocol, okay? It's also a distance vector protocol. Don't worry about them, we will understand what's meant by distance vector, link state, okay? Then under link state we have OSPF. OSPF basically stands for open shortest path first, it basically does routing by selecting the shortest path to forward the routes. Okay, then we have ISIS, which is I've never used this one, but you should consider it. ISIS, right? Then under hybrid we have EIGRP. EIGRP basically stands for Enhanced Interior Gateway Routing Protocol. Okay, it's an extended version of this one. Sorry. It's an extended version of IGRP. Okay, but now it's both link state and distance vector. Alright, so under EGP, which is exterior gateway protocol, we have path vector. Under path vector is BGP, border gateway protocol. Okay, a border gateway protocol is basically used to connect two or more autonomous systems. Okay, autonomous system basically stands for an area of application. For example, you want to connect your institution network, your campus network, to another network which is located far away. Okay, so to connect those different autonomous systems, we will use border gateway protocol. Okay, so let's say we have an institution here and another one here. Okay, so let's say in this institution we use routing protocols such as RIP, OSPF, and static. Okay, and also in this one also we use RIP, we use OSPF and static, the three routing protocols. And now to connect this autonomous system to this one, in between we use a border gateway protocol, okay, which is BGP. Okay, this is an autonomous system. This one is also a separate autonomous system. To connect the two autonomous systems, we use a border gateway protocol. Okay, inside autonomous system we can use various routing protocols. Okay guys, so I hope you understand the application of each protocol, and let's see what we have next. Static routing. Static routing basically is a process through which we have to manually add routes in the routing table. It's upon the network administrator to configure the static routes in that every router in the network. Okay, and now the advantages of this routing protocol: there is less or no CPU overhead, then it conserves bandwidth. Okay, another one, it adds a layer of security, since only admin is allowed to add routing of a network. Okay, and now the disadvantages. You know, the process of moving from one router to another, then configuring the static routing of each network is very tiresome when it comes to large topology. Okay, so understand the meaning of static routing, the advantages and disadvantages. How to configure it is what we will cover in the next class. Okay, so basically this class is about theory that is very, very important in your part. And now default routing. Default routing, this is a method where the router is configured to send all packets toward a single router, okay, which is called the next hop. Basically what's meant by the next hop, I will go back to the previous slide. So for this router, the next hop is this one. It jumps first hop. Okay, so the router is configured to have a default route that will forward every packet through this interface to this router here. Okay, that's what we basically mean by default routing. Okay, we forward all the traffic to a single router known as the next hop. Okay, then it doesn't matter to which network the packet belongs to. Okay, so it's forwarded out to a router which is configured for default routing, right? Then it generally uses stub routers. A stub router is a router which has only one route to all other networks. Guys, this is very important, and don't worry about it. This is now we are going to demonstrate on our practical parts when we will configure default routing, and it's very easy, guys. For the case of static routing and default routing, configuring is very easy. But now what we will dwell much of our time on is dynamic routing. Okay, under dynamic routing we say, so under dynamic routing makes automatic adjustment of the routes according to the current state of the route in the routing table. Okay, dynamic basically works based on the current route in the routing table. Okay, it updates the routing table based on the updates it's received from the other nodes. Okay, so dynamic uses protocol to discover network destination. Dynamic uses protocol to discover network destinations and the routes to reach it. So basically we consider VoIP and OSPF as the best example of dynamic routing protocols. Okay, and most of our projects we will be using VoIP, OSPF, default routing and static routing mostly. And if you have to configure a different autonomous system, we will employ BGP. Okay, then automatic adjustment will be made to reach the network destination if one route goes down. This is now the very important part of dynamic routing. Suppose one route goes down, redundancy, it chooses the other route. Very important in dynamic routing. For the case of static, when the route is down, that's the end of the network. It can compromise the entire network. Okay, so advantages: it's easy to configure and more effective in selecting the best path. The disadvantages of the dynamic routing now, it comes where it consumes a lot of bandwidth. Okay, then also it's not secure as static routing. Remember, in static routing we said it's only admin that is allowed to add routes in the network. Okay, and now there are some features of dynamic protocol that we should underline. The router should have the same dynamic protocol running in order to exchange routes. Okay, for example, when we configure a router A, let's say we have router A, B, right, and they are connected. These two routers should have the same dynamic routing protocol in order to exchange route. If it's RIP on this side, it should also be RIP on this side. If it is OSPF, it should also be OSPF on this side. Okay, when a router finds a change in the topology, then the router advertises to all other routers. Whenever we have a change, an update in the network topology, okay, let's say this router B was connected to router C and router D. and this link goes down. So router B will realize that router D is down, okay, and it will update its routing table and sends the update to router C and router B, okay, so that router A and router C can also update the routing table. Okay guys, I hope you understand the three types of the routing protocols, the three categories: static, default, and dynamic. Okay, let's see what we have next. The differences between static and dynamic routing. Okay, so number one, in static routing, routes are user defined. Okay, the admin goes and configure the routes. But in the dynamic routing, routes are updated according to the topology. It's dynamic. Okay. Number two, static routing does not use complex routing algorithms. Okay, it's static. You just go and configure the routes. But in dynamic routing, it uses complex routing algorithm. For example, VoIP uses some algorithm, OSPF uses some algorithms, right? So in number three, static routing provides high and more security. As we've been saying that static routing, the admin will have to include the routes on his own, okay? But in dynamic routing, it provides less security, okay? So security has the need. So security is a very important issue here. You should know that in static routing there is more security than in dynamic routing. So static routing is manual, okay? Whenever there is an update in the network, the admin will have to configure the static routes. But dynamic routing is automated, okay? And number five, static routing is implemented in small networks, is more preferable in small networks. But dynamic routing covers both small network and large networks, okay? In static routing, additional resources are not required. But in dynamic routing, additional resources are required, okay? And finally, in static routing, a failure of a link will disrupt the rerouting, okay? But in dynamic, a failure of a link will not disrupt the rerouting. So guys, it's very important to understand the differences between the two routing categories, okay? Static routing and dynamic routing, okay? Alright guys, so I think that will mark the end of today's slide. So let's go for a recap. I hope you understood the process of routing, okay? And you know that by default a router only knows the direct connected networks, and understanding these various routing protocols, okay? Static, default, and dynamic. Under dynamic, you must understand interior gateway protocol and exterior gateway protocol, okay? And under interior gateway protocol, there are distance vector, link state, and hybrid. And guys, these routing protocols, don't worry about them. We are going to cover them in our practicals, okay? So from the next classes, we'll start with the static routing, then default routing, then much of our time will be in dynamic routing to understand how to configure all these routing protocols under dynamic routing, okay? And After we have done configuring all this protocol, I hope you will understand how you can configure the routing protocols to enable the devices to communicate in a network. Let's say a network that has 3 or 4 routers. Okay, you just configure any of these routing protocol. Okay, and basically I always recommend dynamic. Under dynamic, I always recommend OSPF and RIP. Okay, and there are some circumstances that we must use default. Okay, and some static. So guys, that will mark the end of today's class. Let's meet again in the next class. See you, and remember